Nā mihi nui iho mā kei te whakaronga mai koutou ki te rongopai a ihu karaiti mai te puka puka a māka. Welcome back, friends. It's great to be with you as we continue our journey through the book of Mark. We're up to session 49 now. Pretty amazing that it's taken this long to get only 2/3 of the way through the story. I'm Buckshot, speaking to you from Te Upoka or Te Ika, the head of the fish, the bottom part of the North Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand, near Wellington. If you're new to these presentations, can I encourage you to check out the earlier presentations, the earlier posts, as they set out a lot of the background and direction of this story that means so much to us in God Squad. We've covered a lot of territory so far, and it is really important to the context and understanding of the rest of the story, and even particularly today's session that I have to talk about. Last time we reached another significant marker in Mark's story about the good news Jesus began announcing in chapter 1. Jesus has arrived in Jerusalem. We're 2/3 of the way through the story now. The remaining third of our story will be focusing on just 1 week in the life of Christ, his last. The weight of this should not be lost on us, the modern readers. The first third was set around Galilee and the Capernaum synagogue. The next third was the road trip to Jerusalem, travelling possibly a chaotic caravan of training and teaching. And now in this last third, we will see the enactment, the fulfillment and the outworking of all that Jesus has been preaching and practicing on his way. So Nigel spoke to us last about how Jesus arrived in Jerusalem on an ass, a donkey, with peasants lauding him and celebrating his arrival in town. "Lord, save us," they shouted. This was a choreographed piece of street theatre harking back to an image in Zechariah chapter 9 about the liberation of Jerusalem. This procession is expressly anti-military, anti-violence in its call to a new way of life, of humble, peaceful and loving neighborliness. Jesus is about to confront the elite of his time on their turf, but in the most creative and unexpected way that even his closest followers, who had been preparing on the road for this moment, struggled to comprehend, and they struggled to engage appropriately with this moment. Maybe we too struggle with to get the full breadth and depth of the vision that Jesus has. That's okay. We're not alone in that. But let's not despair, but rather persevere in our discipleship practice and be open to discovering more unexplored corners of God's kingdom on earth. I hope you're ready to hear this next section of the story. It is pretty out there, and it's often minimized because it is such a dramatic and shocking moment in the story we are unpacking. As an introduction to today's text, I would like to just quote Mahatma Gandhi, who described Jesus as the most active resistor known to history. This is non-violence par excellence. So our text today has Jesus, the most active resistor to violence and military oppression in the history of the world, up to something pretty cool. So our text is Mark chapter 11, verses 12 to 19. Next day, as they were leaving Bethany, he felt hungry. Seeing a fig tree and leaf some distance away, he went to see if he could find any fruit on it. But when he came up to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he addressed the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. So they reached Jerusalem and went into the temple and began driving out the men selling and buying there. He upset the tables of the money changers and the seats of the dove sellers. Nor would he allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he taught them and said, "Does not Scripture say, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all peoples'? But you have turned it into a bandit's den." This came to the ears of the chief priests and the scribes, and they tried to find some way of doing away with him. Some translations have destroy him here. They were afraid of him because the people were carried away by his teaching, and when evening came, he went out of the city. This is the gospel of Christ. Praise to Christ the Word. So Jesus rode into town yesterday on that donkey, called in at the temple for a look, and then retired for the night out at Bethany, a few miles out of town. Today he gets up hungry, goes looking for fruit on a nearby fig tree. The symbolism here is huge and significant. The fig tree is always in Scripture an image of the hopes of all that Israel can be, an emblem of peace, security, and prosperity during the golden ages past, present, and future. Trees in Old Testament Scripture always carry symbolic significance. You can check out references in Jeremiah 8, Hosea 9, Micah 7, and Joel 1 for examples. Fruitful trees were a sign of God's blessing on the people. Withering trees, a metaphorical sign that God was not happy and even judging the people. Today, the hope of Israel in that fig tree is found empty. It cannot satisfy anyone's hunger, and Jesus curses it. Tomorrow, when they all pass by again, and we'll hear about this next time, they discover that it has died. Like the seed in chapter 4 that fell on the rocky ground, it withers away. This arrival of Jesus, the Messiah, into Jerusalem is not insignificant. In the prophets, one of the main reasons that judgment was brought was due to poor practices, corrupt practices in the way the temple system was run. The poor were often being ripped off, and Isaiah 58 is an example that discusses that in detail. The first readers of Mark would know the history, they would know the implications of Jesus cursing this tree. So when Jesus shortly after this arrives in the temple and starts turning over tables and driving out people, there is no doubt what he is doing. These money changers, dove sellers, and others were involved in a racket that exploited people, particularly the poor. There is a widow in a few sessions' time compelled to give all that she has by this racket. Jesus is angry, not because commercial trade is going on in the temple space, but because that trade is rigged, exploiting worshippers seeking purity. The temple in Jerusalem, like other temples of the time, were centers of economic trade overseen by the priests. These places provided employment for a wide range of artisans and traders. So it was in everyone's interest that the trade should be fair and sustainable, but it was not. Ananias, the high priest, according to Josephus, was called the great procurer of money, as he oversaw the temple system, a clear sign of the way things worked. This was a pyramid scheme in the temple, fleecing the poor. Our text singles out dove sellers and money changers. The money changers were street-level outlets for the major banking enterprises that changed money of any flavour from around the world into acceptable and pure currency for temple transactions. Jesus' attention to their practices is a direct assault on those behind him running the oppressive financial system that created a landless peasant class, the very people Jesus had been with in the wilderness that knew how to share. The dove sellers are interesting also. Doves were the cheapest acceptable sacrifice available for purification, and they were used by women and lepers for their cleansing. So these were the main traders, fleecing the poorest and most excluded of God's people, the ones benefiting the most from the second-class nature of landless peasants, women, and lepers, the very people Jesus hung out with, and encouraged that the seeds of love and grace that they had were enough for the kingdom to flourish. So just as he did back in chapter 2 when eating with so-called sinners and outcasts, Jesus is siding with the poor, just as he did in the Capernaum synagogue where he drove out a demon that withered a man's arm, yet driving out exploitation. that is withering the people of God. He didn't just stop there though. He then forbade people to carry goods through the temple. The buyers were now in his sights as well. He has stepped up a gear and is now behaving as the stronger man, entering a strong man's house, binding him up and plundering his property that we heard about in chapter 3. The temple was shut down while Jesus explained in a brief teaching section what was going on, what he was up to. Does not Scripture say, aspirationally, that my house will be a place of prayer for all peoples? What a dream! What a vision! All people. A vision that is cast in Isaiah 56. Go and check that out. Could that include those discarded by the rich and powerful as non-people? You bet it does. The eunuchs, the foreigners, everyone else is invited. But no, you have turned it into a bandit's den. Mark may have one eye on Malachi's reference to robbery of God here, the poor, the worker, the orphan, etc., as he quotes from Jeremiah chapter 7. Jeremiah is insisting that Israel only has a dwelling place while they live justly in their relations to everyone. No wonder the fig tree is cursed and the temple is turned upside down in this beautiful piece of direct action against corruption and the abuse of power. Next, of course, as happens in these situations, the police are alerted to this outrageous expression of passion and care for the poor. The chief priests and scribes turn up and are determined to destroy this Jesus, as they are afraid of his influence on the poor. The game is up. Jesus has finally exposed them in their seat of power, as he has been doing little by little on the whole road trip from Galilee, actually binding the strong man and liberating his goods right here. And then our text ends anticlimactically. Jesus leaves when evening came and returns to Bethany to prepare for his next engagement at the temple, debating with the religious and political elite about this day in the temple. What do we think of this day of action in the temple? How might this inspire us as we follow in the way of Christ? This is less gentle Jesus, meek and mild, maybe more loving Jesus, passionate and wild. Stay tuned this week. This is the last week in the life of Christ. It's so action-packed as he brings to a conclusion all that he has preached and practiced on the road. May we be prepared for challenge and change as we continue to explore and unpack what this could mean for us today as followers of Christ in God Squad CMC. We are not just a motorcycle club. We are so much more as followers of this table-tipping traveller. How does our love for and allegiance with this rebel, this resistor, this dreamer of a better way and day for the poor bring us into conflict with the abuse of power today? Are we aware of our own complicit connections to power? Are we afraid of what Jesus may do in the temple of our lives? Are we prepared to continue with this Jesus on the road, embracing those demonized by the corporate military complex running our world? Our demoniac in chapter 5 was created by that very same military complex, yet humanized by Jesus entering his location. This is a powerful and world-changing drama that we can be involved in at street level, right here, right today. May we draw closer together as we read the remainder of this text and live through the dangers of this way of life, this way of Jesus. We won't survive such a life on our own. Cheers, and God be with you as we draw together. Kia kaha, kia maia, kia manawanui, I roto i te aroha o te ariki. Rangamai e kia tātou katoa.